Now, Mr. C.R. Wiley, how do you prefer to be referred to? C.R.,
No,
Mr. Wiley, Dr. Wiley?
just call me Chris.
All right, cool.
Awesome. Alrighty, well, we are live on YouTube, and Rumble is still question mark, but we will get rolling because Rumble is always a question mark these days. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. There's been a lot of talk about aliens and UFOs in the news lately, and frankly, I think it's all a load of crap. It seems just like it's a shiny lure in the water meant to keep us fish hooked and distracted from the real news stories going on. Currently, the people of East Palestine are suffering from the results of a controlled explosion of the derailed train that was signed off on by both Republican governor of Ohio and the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania. Beyond this, the CDC put out a report saying that 10% of high school students attempted suicide in 2021. Also, they might reveal some names at long last of the people involved in the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking crimes. In addition to all these things, Chelsea Handler put out a video that lit the internet up about her life as a childless woman. And culturally, I think it might be one of the biggest stories that perfectly embodies what's wrong with our culture. So, joining us to discuss all these things, we have many great guests. It's Monday Night Live, so drop your questions in the chat. We will answer them throughout the stream. Get a good full pipe and get comfy because we have a lot to go through. So we're joined by first-time guest C.R. Wiley. So Chris, say hi.
Hello. Good to be
Please
with you.
tell everyone who you are and what you do.
Well, I go by CR. That's my nom de plume, as they say. But my name's Chris, and I've written a number of books, working on a number of books, and I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest and in the battleground area of Washington. And I've been a commercial real estate investor and professor of philosophy. And I've got 3 grown kids and a wonderful wife, and I'm feeling really great.
Awesome. Well, welcome. Glad to have you.
Yeah, glad to be here.
And back again is Joey the Bootmaker. So Joey, say hello.
Hey everybody, good to be back as always.
Awesome. And fresh off the set of the Steve Deace Show, regular co-host Michael Aper.
That's true. Hey friends, I'm a God-fearing student of the Bible. I want to promote good things of righteousness.
Awesome. Well, we'll get into our first story. So this is from Newsweek.com. Chelsea Handler has divided the internet thanks to her skit about enjoying life without children. Called A Day in the Life of a Childless Woman, the video follows Handler on her daily routine as she narrates her comically exaggerated habits. Quote, I wake up at 6 a.m. I remember that I have no kids to take to school, so I take an edible, masturbate, and go back to sleep, she starts. I wake up at 12:30 p.m. and get ready for a busy day doing whatever the F I feel like. Handler continues, I put on my most impractical and stylish shoes since I won't be chasing a child around the grocery store. Then during her joke about popping to Paris for a croissant, she says, I do a meditation sesh on the plane since I have no screaming kids, allowing me all the time in the world to become enlightened. The weightlessness of my existence has granted me superhuman powers. Handler then says she teleports back home to get ready for a night out with whatever hot guy she met on dating app Raya that day, and the text on her phone reads, Wanna F tonight. She continues by saying she scaled Mount Everest for exercise and invents a time machine to go back in history to kill Hitler. It's amazing what you can do when you have this much free time, she concludes, before adding, and that's a day in the life of a childless woman. So there's a lot to respond to there, but we'll go to Mr. C.R. Wiley first for your initial reaction.
Well, she sounds weightless. If you know what I mean, that's actually, she's apparently unaware that that's not a positive thing. So weightlessness means you lack substance. And she's using this sort of image to imply that she is not weighed down with care, or with responsibilities, but when in fact she's light in the worst way. When a person, so like when we say I can take you lightly, means that you don't have substance, you don't have weight, the only way you acquire weight is by undertaking difficult tasks and being a responsible person. And she's not pursuing it from the sound of it. Now, she's making fun. Maybe she's making fun of herself a little bit, but I don't know how old she is. What's our guess? What's her age?
57.
She's 57. Well, I think she's lying in a number of respects. I know a number of middle-aged older women, and sort of in her sort of stage of life, and they're not happy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm talking about childless career women.
Right. Yeah. Well, Michael, what was your initial reaction? Because you've got quite a face on right now.
She presents that material as if it's something that should be desired, and I receive it as if it's just the worst possible outcome for a life. I would hate to think that my life provided so little purpose that I am left with nothing but to wake up and masturbate and meditate so that I can achieve some self-perspective that allows me to think that I've achieved something great, when in fact I have nothing that I'm responsible for and nobody that depends on me. That doesn't seem like that's something to flaunt. I think it's just confusing all in all, and largely because my worldview is in stark contrast to this individual's. So yeah, it's sad to think that someone would live in such a way, and kind of like what Chris was saying, she may be making fun of herself a little bit, but it seems to be masking some deep insecurities.
Yeah. Well, Joey, this is a topic that's pretty relevant to you, since you are just about on the beginning of your journey into fatherhood. So what was your initial thought?
Well, I'd say it sounds like she's masking how miserable she maybe really is inside, because I witnessed my wife, and I see her being a wife and about to become a mother, and it's definitely how women were designed. What the job they were designed to do.
Yeah. And really a correction, she is a mother already, we should say, if we're
correct. Yes.
being correct.
Mother to a child not yet earthbound.
Well, earthbound even.
Well,
not yet.
Not out of the womb.
Not yet out of the womb. There we go. We probably get our terms straight.
Couple more days.
Yeah.
Is it days now?
Yeah, I think we're about a week and a half out from due date.
Oh, cool.
So awesome to see. So Chris, we'll go to you first, but why do you think that this is such a recurring message that specifically pop culture and Hollywood is pushing on individuals?
Well, I suspect that it has to do with a need to reassure women that the decisions they've made were good ones. Mm-hmm. And I think the other guys have brought up good points about the doubts that she may be wrestling with along that line. I don't have to get up and I guess reassure myself that things I've been engaged with or the commitments I've made are still valuable or worthwhile. I deal with kind of the outcomes of some real blessings in my life. I've got 3 grown kids and I've got grandchildren. And like I noted, I'm 60 years old. So this woman is, she's a member of my generation, you could say. And I know many women like her. And I think that they're starting to see the consequences of the choices they've made. So good choices very often have a front end or front loaded with a lot of difficulty, and then you enjoy the benefits or the returns down the road. When you have small children, there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of worry, and there's a lot of uncertainty. You just don't know how things are going to work out. And of course, in God's providence, it's ordered by the Lord, but nevertheless, from the perspective on the ground, there's just a lot of question marks. But when things work out well, you understand what we see in the Old Testament with regard to the references to the blessings that you enjoy when you have children and grandchildren. And furthermore, she's counting on a number of social systems and economic sort of institutions to provide for her in her old age that um, she's taken for granted. And I don't think that she's factored into her thinking the possibilities that those things could let her down. And I think that they will. And we're starting to see the evidence of that. I just read today that Social Security is going to go insolvent before they thought it was. This is the way these people operate. they don't want to let you know the truth until it's already too late. And when it comes to Social Security, basically it's there's no lockbox out there. There's no like savings account with your name on it. What comes in now goes out now. So we're in a baby bust situation. Fewer people are paying in, more people are drawing down. I don't think it. What we're going to see with Social Security is a significant decrease in benefits and a significant increase in the age at which you can acquire those benefits or enjoy those benefits. And when it comes to the stock market, which is what 401ks and other retirement vehicles are relying on, just in the past year and a half, people have seen those balance sheets dramatically alter in a negative way, and it was a real wake-up call. One day, you're feeling on top of the world because you got a 401k with a balance of $1.5 million, and half a year later, you're down to $500,000. I'm not exaggerating. That's the way it's been for a lot of older people. So, she's made a bet, and I think she's made a bad bet.
Yeah. So when it comes to like the biblical perspective, do you think that individuals who are making that bet, do you think that they are ultimately just missing the mark in terms of what the family structure is from a biblical perspective?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that they really do think that they can. I think that the hubris of the modern outlook is that we can reinvent the world. That human nature is plastic, that it's malleable, it's something that can be altered at a fundamental level. And I think that they believe that we have the wherewithal to create new structures that are to our, sort of appeal to us. And they more or less reject the givenness of things. They really don't want to receive the world as it's made. They want to remake it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think changed that caused this new atmosphere of sort of revolutionary change being desired among, especially, I mean, the young individuals in America are definitely embracing a lot of those ideas, but beyond just the youth, we see Chelsea Handler's 57 and she's actively promoting these lifestyle choices that ultimately are going to leave many, many men and women childless, dying by themselves with no one around to take care of them in their old age.
Yeah, and the institutions that they rely upon unable to provide the care that they think they will, because those institutions rely on younger people to staff them and fund them. But anyway, it goes back quite a way. I could take you back to the late medieval era and talk about the origins of modernity and the rise of nominalism in the 14th century. But but it's in other words, I'm having a little fun here. The roots go way back. It's not the 1960s. It's not even the French Revolution. It goes way back. And there's been a lot of really good work in the last, I'd say, 50 years on the intellectual history of the West, and people like Augusto Del Noce, Philip Reif, just really world class. I mean, I think there are people. Charles Taylor, for example, in his book, what's that book called? It's not modern age. But anyway, it just goes to show that I don't think much about him. I can't remember the name of his book. But he's kind of second tier. I mean, I think that we know what happened. And it was some bad ideas that bubbled up from the world of theology. And we see the tremors, or I should say it's sort of like a theological tsunami, and people will try to identify, something that happened in the early 60s with, no prayer in public schools, or, abortion on demand, or something like that. All those are effects. It goes much further back, and it goes back to theology, not even philosophy. Philosophy is actually kind of secondary. So anyway, this is stuff I think about all the time, and I write about. I don't want to be tedious, but it goes back a ways.
Well, Chris, you're talking about a evolution of thought that is, I think, from what you're talking about, is more of a macroevolution over the past centuries. What I would say in this circumstance, there's a big push in our contemporary culture to not have children. There's shaming for families that have more than one children or desire more than one child. I think there's a thread that can be followed in a microevolution, a more focal spectrum, like you're saying, even in the 60s, that churches separated from state in such a way that there cannot be religious experience in the school setting. Or in my own experience and our experience shared, the movies that were being published and put out throughout the early late 90s, there were a lot of movies that the sole and purpose of the movie was to say that families that have divorced parents, it's okay, and the children are going to be okay. They're still loved, which isn't wrong in and of itself, but it put divorced parents on this pedestal that makes it out to be normal. And once that level of dysfunction in a family unit has been brought to normalcy, then what's the next step, and the next step, and the next step? And now we look at the family normalcy of, yeah, sure, maybe there's two dads and they've adopted a child and are grooming them to be a gender that they were not born into. We've come such a long distance in a short time from the traditional family that I think our grandparents were familiar with, and already, let's say 100 years later, that traditional family has been disrupted by economic crisis, by cultural crisis, and now I think we're in a place where it seems that there's a big shift in ideology, a shift in purpose, where a lot of people are subscribing to that form of thinking that they shouldn't have children, or that they are better off not having children, or having a committed relationship or monogamous relationship to one individual in long term. Instead, we're degrading these functions that have kept our society alive since the beginning of time. And Connor, when you say like the biblical implications, it makes me think, okay, well, yes, there are biblical prerogatives to what a marriage is and the blessing of having children. But there's also cultural norms that were at place at the time of the writing of Scripture, where I would say a 56-year-old single woman who had never married would be be seen more as a burden on society than a success by any rate throughout most of history. And feel free to disagree. I think that's
right. Yeah, I think that's right. I've written on those themes, and I think you're right. I don't have any disagreements with anything you said. I think in terms of how this is all felt and experienced in our time, you're absolutely right. In terms of the near term developments, I'm from a broken home. I grew up in the 60s, so my childhood was a childhood that was that occurred within the sort of in the boundaries or the penumbra of college campuses. My father was a junior faculty at University of Buffalo and later at Washington U in St. Louis, and so I know that kind of scene, and the me generation was something I experienced firsthand. So I think you're absolutely right, and what we're seeing play out is a kind of script that has an outcome that I think we all kind of know, but it seems as though we're in the middle of the story and it's just got to have to play itself out. I wish I could say otherwise. Now, I happen to be in a situation where I defied all of that all the way along, and basically, I had the benefit of growing up in a kind of bohemian environment surrounded by progressive idiots. And because that's the case, I always knew that they were full of it. So I very intentionally set myself, decided to pursue sort of a quest to understand the world that they were deconstructing, and discovered that it was better than the world that they were trying to create. By the way, I pastor a church with very large families. I've got one elder with 13 kids, another with 12, another with 9, and another with 7, and another with 5, and he's just getting started. So
That's great. I like to hear that. It's encouraging.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. Joey, it looks like you were going to say something.
Well, I'm just wondering too, with our current culture of instant satisfaction and indulgence, if that has sort of greased the wheels, so to speak, to kind of make this sort of mindset even more prevalent in our day, in the current time, because that's kind of how, especially I think in the next 10 or 15 years or so, we're going to have a generation that their whole life has grown up with instant satisfaction and constant dopamine triggers in their day-to-day. So I don't know if, I don't know what I'm getting at there. Just an observation.
Yeah. Well, you see it even just with our social media. I mean, just from the time that we all, all three of us were growing up, we were kind of the first generation that really grew up with social media. Wasn't there on our early years, but kind of middle school and up, we had access to social media. And you look at the development from YouTube to suddenly you got these bite-sized TikToks that are like, 10 seconds to 60 seconds tops in their length. I mean, that already the attention spans of the youth is actually going down. That's been proven by multiple studies. And the only thing that's encouraging is on the flip side, there's almost this completely different world that has developed, which is long form podcasts like this have kind of taken off. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's just two different worlds that are growing at once, or if there's a lot of crossover in those worlds. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that.
Well, Scripture tells us the wheat and the tares grow together. So yes, it's a really bad time, but it's also a really great time. My sons, my children, all three of my children are grown and have done hard things and are accomplished people. And my two sons are married, own their own houses, have kids. So it's possible. They're basically the age of you guys, and so I'm old enough to be your father. But so there are people like yourselves and like my sons that are out there, and so there are a lot of great people still out there. And one of the, there are a lot of things that we can note that are kind of downsides to the internet, social media, and stuff like that. One upside is this conversation we're having. I've never met you guys. It's my first time with you. I'm glad to be with you.
Likewise.
Well, what's interesting though, and maybe this is just my own anecdotal observations, but it feels like, at least, and maybe it's dangerous for me to say feels, but it seems to me like there is starting to be a shift in a positive direction. Just in terms of the way that the public is viewing a lot of the lies that our culture has been selling them. I actually think that like the transgender movement, for example, is one that I see right now actively being pushed back upon. I would say maybe I'm wrong about this because I don't have numbers to this, but it seems like the generation, the public at large is starting to push back on transgenderism. And that was not even a thing, honestly, even a couple of years ago. And I don't think that this is the only catalyst, but I think one of the main turning points was honestly Matt Walsh's "What Is a Woman" documentary. I do think that changed the conversation. I think it made a lot more people a lot more bold about how they approach transgenderism, and obviously, transgenderism is a whole different path from childless lifestyles, but it's still ultimately that self-serving lifestyle that we're talking about. But I don't know. Maybe that's just my observation. But do you guys feel like there's been a change in that? Because to me, it seems like the average person is a lot more fed up with transgenderism, for example, than they were even like a year, 2 years ago.
I think it may have to do with your relevant scope of understanding. In your circumstance, Connor, for example, you consume a lot of conservative media specifically just by nature of what you're interested in and who you listen to. And there's a narrative there that's going to be more aware of the opposition to a lot of the more liberal leftist agenda of transgender, abortion rights, things like this. Whereas I do know that in a lot of, say, for example, state university campuses that are under the tutorship of more liberal-leaning faculty members, they're being affirmed in their sexual identities as they are fluidly changing. They may have a different experience because of their scope of understanding or their scope of influence. So I feel like we are seeing more pushback, and I think that may just be the increased dichotomy that exists in our culture, where as one side of the aisle is emboldened to be more aggressive, more forward about certain things of marketing campaigns about transgenderism or ad campaigns about abortion rights and how it's loving your neighbor to allow them to have an abortion. Clearly, that's going to trigger some responses, and it will elicit a strong response from a conservative Christian community that is against those things. So what I'm seeing, at least, is that while one side of the aisle is becoming more hard pressed, then they're going to respond more aggressively as well. So while, yes, it's encouraging to see that people are not willing to just take it on the chin when it comes to these ideological differences, I think it can also be a sign of strengthening in the opposition as well.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you say, Michael. I mean, I lived in Cambridge for a decade, right between Harvard and MIT. I went to Harvard Divinity School. I think I'm pretty personally connected with both sides of this matter. It's remarkable how people can double down on dumb, and I don't think that we're going to resolve these matters in a kind of deliberative mode. I think what's going to happen is cultural crisis is going to sort of create conditions in which people have to decide what's real, and the implications of their choices will follow. So if they continue to pursue the lifestyle that this woman is trying to, I guess, valorize, they're going to basically either be euthanized or just die lonely and forgotten.
Yeah. So what kind of What kind of event needs to take place for that decision to be made?
Well, I think it could be anything, but I suspect it'll be a economic crisis of a scale that we've not seen before.
Yeah. One of your books, I believe you focus in on kind of what you would do to survive the end of the world. Is that right?
Yep.
Could you tell us more about that?
Well, most stuff that you read in sort of the survivalist literature is basically it's beans, bullets, and bunkers. Basically, the strategy is I'm going to like hole up in a hole in the ground and have a lot of ammo and eat canned goods, and that's just crazy. Eventually you have to come out. Then you got to rebuild, and furthermore, your shelter is one that isolates you, prevents, keeps you from being constructively engaged with other people. So what we need is communities, small communities, high trust communities. Generally, those high trust communities develop most readily within family and household structures and within common sets of convictions, like communities that form around those, like churches. We should look at the Jews. I mean, the Jews, they're just sui generis. I mean, there's nobody like them. And they've survived everything that you could throw at them. And so I think there's insight there. Now, sometimes liberal Jews have forgotten what their own history teaches them. Some of the worst sort of Jews are the progressive Jews who basically have embraced a different form of genocide. They don't have kids, but I'm talking about traditional Jews. I've got lots of friends who are Jews, and I've got good relationships with them. And I admire their resilience, and I think there are lessons for us to take from their experience.
Yeah. And what was the name of that book if any listeners are interested in picking it up?
Oh, Man in the House, I think is the one you're referring to.
Yeah, that sounds right. That's awesome. So from your perspective, high trust communities for the sake of outlasting economic or social turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that we can all just sort of be little islands of consciousness is just stupid. I mean, we're social creatures. We're enriched through our interactions with each other. We need each other. And anybody who says otherwise is out of touch with reality.
Yeah. Well, I figured I should have us transition then to talk about a disaster that has struck, real disaster. So this is from the Post-Millennial. In a February 14 press conference, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine revealed that both he and Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro signed off on the decision to conduct a controlled release of chemicals from the derailed Norfolk Southern train in East Palestine, Ohio. It was clear at that point that we were faced with two bad options, DeWine said, of hours and days immediately following the incidents. DeWine later stated that we then made the decision to go ahead with the second option, which was to control police. DeWine said that shortly after the derailment, when it became clear that an explosion would occur, he spoke with railroad representatives, bringing Shapiro into the conversation of the next steps and weighing the risks of leaving the train to explode or setting the chemicals on fire. So skipping down a bit here, Governor Shapiro and I spent considerable time, up to about 2 hours, I recall, asking a lot of questions about how that would take place, DeWine added. In a February 6 press conference, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro warned residents who live near East Palestine, Ohio, that they need to evacuate, indicating that he signed off on the controlled burn of chemicals that were held in the derailed train cars. According to ABC News, following the setting of the fire, Shapiro said that the vent and burn operation went as planned and that no concerning air and water quality readings have been detected. So obviously that's a huge news story that many have commented on. What I think is really interesting is the fact that there is both a Republican governor and a Democratic governor who both signed off upon this. And just the idea that this went off without a hitch is humorous to me. But Joe, you want to give your initial thoughts?
Sounds like a lack of planning and a lack of transparency to me. Because this came out, what, 10 days after the burn and release? The release and burn?
I think so, right about that.
Yeah. It seems like you'd maybe want to notify your residents in the 1 mile radius maybe to evacuate the day you were going to do this rather than 2 days after.
Yeah. Well, that's smart thinking there. Chris, what was your thought when you heard this news story?
Well, I mean, it is a really challenging set of conditions that these people have to deal with. But at the same time, I guess my thought is the way they've conducted themselves has further undermined the credibility of many civil authorities. So we're at a point where, and I wonder if these guys have, Michael noted that people who find themselves in liberal environments have a lot of different inputs than people who find themselves in conservative environments. And my suspicion is that many government officials are surrounded by people who affirm them and don't challenge them. And consequently, they may be in a kind of epistemic bubble, unaware that their credibility is at an all-time low. And the whole COVID thing, the way it all unfolded, just decimated the credibility of the experts in the minds of many normies. I mean, I'm not talking about people on the fringes, either left or right. They're always suspicious, on both extremes of anybody in the government. I'm talking about people who make their lives, sort of pushing paper in cubicles. They are at a point where they don't trust the authorities anymore. They don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know if these governors are aware of that, but the way they've conducted this whole sort of, the way they've handled this very challenging situation has only fed the kind of the acids or sort of contributed to the acids that are eating away at their own legitimacy.
Which may or may not end up being a positive.
Yeah.
At what cost, though?
Right?
Yeah.
Correct.
We need authorities that we can trust. I mean, it's just the way it is. And I certainly, my entire life, I grew up, I won't go into all the details, but I have lots of reasons to distrust the sort of government, the people in the white coats and with the clipboards. I've never trusted them, and I've never been disappointed in their stupidity. It's always been affirmed to me that they don't know what they're talking about. And they put on a great show, and they want you to trust them, and they'll do everything they can to make you feel awkward and stupid. And if you don't, but very often people who don't do better than the people who do.
Yeah. Billy Boy in the chat said there was a reporter arrested at the press conference for trying to do his job of reporting.
Yeah. I'm not surprised.
You know what strikes me about that excerpt that you read, Connor, is not as much what it does say as much as is what it doesn't say. And what it doesn't say is that the governors had consultation with chemical engineers or environmental biologists on the repercussions of the decision. We'd like to assume that takes place. And really, whether you're conservative or liberal leaning, that seems like that would be the obvious course of action. And kind of like Joey said, there's a lack of transparency there where, for one, we ought to know who they're consulting, if they are consulting anybody, but it kind of seems like they took a narrow scope on a black and white decision that was not black or white and made an impulsive decision because something had to be done. And like Chris mentioned earlier, it's not a good set of circumstances no matter who's in charge. It's kind of like, people would blame George W. Bush for Katrina. Well, sure, things could have been handled differently, but he didn't set up that situation. He just did the best he could to respond to that situation. And certainly there are areas of betterment that could have taken place, just as there are now. But from what I've seen and what you've told us already, it seems like it was somewhat of an impulsive decision that was not properly educated.
Yeah. And did you guys see the video of JD Vance sticking that stick in the river by chance?
Oh,
The oily residue or whatever it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of
so-
the oil effect, oil
So
and
for,
water
for
effect.
tonight's background, I put hillbilly elegy in the on the bookshelf there. But JD Vance, he went to Ohio to meet with his constituents and figure out what's going on there, and trying to do his own research, because apparently reporters are being arrested or whatever ridiculousness is happening up there. And he took a video of him going to a stream in Ohio, and he takes a big old stick and he just jabs it into the water, and you just see rainbow bubble up to the surface. It's ridiculous. So I don't know, but Chris, you mentioned that you have had a lot of reasons over the years to not be trusting of what officials say. So could you elaborate on that a little bit, if you're comfortable?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I was a ward of the state as a child, spent time in foster care, got to know a lot of psychologists who were tasked with dealing with people like me as a child. And I always felt that they were just hired hands, and that, they're decent people. I mean, they're not bad. I mean, but the kind of thing that they were expected to do, which is essentially fill the role of parents, they weren't even interested in, for one thing, and they couldn't perform for another. But what it did is that during that phase of my life, I became, I guess, jaundiced, cynical with regard to the competence of civil authorities, and I've only had it confirmed my entire life. It's just like over and over again. It's just, no, I'm not saying that we can live without these people in an industrial society. I'm just saying that we shouldn't trust them the way that we seem to want to. Mm-hmm. And we should think for ourselves and be well informed and exercise judgment for ourselves, and not just simply defer to the authorities. Like, the authorities are just people like you and me. They might have some insight into some matters that we don't have access to, but I think we give them far too much credit.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that seems to be a theme that we uncover almost every week here of the show. So what do you think is the solution to incompetent leaders?
Well, I just don't think we should expect as much as we expect of them. I think we just need to take matters more into our own hands. We should, I think that the approach is not to vilify those people. A lot of them are just trying to pay their bills and, do their jobs. Some of them are worse, but we see that everywhere. I mean, there are terrible pastors too, there are terrible dads, there are terrible moms. I mean, so that's a given. But I think that we need to be more responsible. We just need to be more aware of the task that we are, sort of, that's inescapable. We need to take care of ourselves as much as we can, look after our own interests as much as we can, not in a selfish way, but just simply in a responsible way, and stop being blind and stupid in just handing over our lives to people because they sound authoritative and stuff.
Yeah. So you would advocate, based on our conversation then, for a strong household and strong individual capabilities. So what does the proper model of a household look like?
Well, I think households should take it upon themselves to be productive and to look after their own interests in an intergenerational way. So obviously, the easiest way to understand this is parents being responsible for the care and education of their children. But there's the other side of it, which is adults being responsible for the care and you know oversight of their elderly parents, and then looking after their own affairs. A lot of the things that I've written, much of what I've written, has just simply been intended to help people sort of just stop thinking or stop believing that the government or your corporation that you work for is got your best interest at heart. Just stop it with that fantasy. Take responsibility for yourself. That doesn't mean they're the enemy. It just means that you've been dumb to expect them to look after you. I mean, I think there were times in my life that this sort of came to me as like a revelation. I remember when I was in college, I just assumed that my academic advisor was somebody who was just going to shepherd me along and just tell me what to do. And then I realized that no, that wasn't what he considered to be his job. I was supposed to take responsibility for my own education, in the sense of being engaged enough to actually learn what was required of me to earn a degree. And that was like I said, that was a revelation. It was like, wow. Fortunately, I got the message in time, and I didn't have to spend an extra year in college or anything like that. But that's what we deal with. I think that people want the government to take care of them at a level that it's unrealistic for governments to provide that level of care. Now, they'll promise to do it,
Of course.
in order to get your vote, to get your support, but that's just stupid to expect them to do it.
So what is the solution then? Because we can't all be experts in all things. So what is the solution for a healthy amount of outsourcing of certain responsibilities to individuals outside both the individual and that individual's family?
Well, let's just think about children and the education of children. I think this is a good place to do that, what you just described. So there are certain things that I don't know. I can't teach my child those things very well. I outsource those things by either sending them off to a school or bringing in a tutor. But I still oversee the education of the child. There comes a point, of course, where the child is an adult and is now responsible for, pursuing education for himself or herself. Become an autodidact, in other words. But until that point, while I may not have all the answers, I need to find the people who do, and I need to hold them accountable to do their jobs as best I can. And I think that that's true across the boards when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to, if we're going to be governed by experts, which is what Woodrow Wilson and all the progressives wanted us to do, basically hand over the keys. Well, then we're essentially we're living in a kind of servitude. We're not actual citizens in a republic any longer. Something different has occurred. We've got to take responsibility for our own lives. Yeah, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean we know everything, but we have to nevertheless be involved in our own self-governance.
Mm-hmm.
That's a tautology. So self-governance means you're involved.
Yeah.
There's something to be said about the amount of knowledge that an individual can possess as well. I think we live in a society that deifies this sense of speciality, that you're special, your education is special, your occupation is special. So if you're an accountant, then nobody expects you to be able to do plumbing or whatever it may be. But certainly throughout successful cultural history, we've had the jack of all trades who's able to be a carpenter and a plumber and an electrician while also being an auto mechanic, while also having a day job as a blue collar worker or even as an academic, and being able to possess the skills necessary to contribute to your own self governance to some degree. And in years past, there's even been the ability of, for some reason, I think of like a pioneer age where men and women were able to cultivate their own food, their own homes, building their homes while also generating some sort of revenue within a community that caused them to contribute to the community at large while also maintaining their own homes. We've come so far from that as a culture and as a community that now we depend on someone else for nearly everything. But if I'm really skilled as an optometrist, then that's all I need to know how to do. Well, in fact, it may be better to be the jack of all trades and yet have something that we can contribute to society as well. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I think that's right, Michael. A couple of books that come to mind are Range, which talks about the advantage that generalists have over specialists. And then Matthew Crawford's book, Shop Class of Soulcraft.
Yeah. I'd agree.
Billy Boy in the chat said, if U.S. House of Representatives were apportioned as called for, we would have 10,667 that would serve us better. Yeah. And that's an interesting conversation in itself, because, then that begs the question, can we scale that? And maybe not, but to some degree, there is definitely something to be said about the fact that, representatives could be much more focused in on their constituents if that was actually properly apportioned, which would hopefully allow for some of these issues of trying to accommodate so many ideologies and worldviews a lot easier for our representatives. Because my word, is bad enough when they have so many representatives, but then you throw in lobbyists and all those other things on top of it, and it gets really messy really quick.
Now, there's a trade-off when it comes to scale. Obviously, the United States is the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to the world, and so we enjoy many benefits due to that. We have the reserve currency that, think about that. I don't know how many of us actually do think about that, but it gives us tremendous advantage in every way. Our military is several times the size of even China. So just in terms of the military force, it's unparalleled in the history of the world. Nevertheless, it's been costly in more ways than just economically. In antiquity, thinkers like Aristotle talked about optimal size when it came to political communities. And we are way, way beyond anything he talked about.
Got some Aristotle politics behind me. Yeah. Unfortunately, I agree with you. And Richard Contramundum, he's in the chat. He said the government is too bloated and disconnected and not at all able to be truly held accountable. I agree. Hear, hear. Well, I want to do a little bit of a transition here, Chris, because you have written a new book, and I'm really interested in it because I'm a bit of a Tolkien nerd, and this is going to be a bit of a transition. But I've got the Tolkien reader right here. So,
great.
So, tell me, why on earth did you not only write a book about one character in Tolkien universe, but specifically you chose Tom Bombadil, which is a deep cut for anyone who has never actually read the books.
Right. Well, he's been an anomaly from the start. Tolkien received letters about him back in the 60s and 70s, asking why in the world you stick that guy in there. And Tolkien's response in his letters tells us that he serves a purpose. So then the question is, well, what purpose could it be? Then in other letters, Tolkien would say, things like, the purpose he served is, well, the term he used, let me see, what was it? It wasn't ambiguous. It was enigmatic, I think it was. So he's an enigma. Now, anything that's enigmatic catches our attention and gets us thinking. And I think that's what Tolkien was up to. He wanted us to think about Bombadil. There are a number of things about Bombadil that are remarkable in the story. Just one of those things is that the Ring of Power that obviously Frodo is going to Mordor to throw into the cracks of doom and destroy, doesn't have any effect on Bombadil. Everyone else is afraid of it. Galadriel's afraid of it. Gandalf's afraid of it. We see them agitated when characters like Frodo and Bilbo offer them the ring. Bombadil commands Frodo to give him the ring, and Frodo does it without even thinking. And then Bombadil makes sort of light of it. He puts it up to his eye and looks through it, and kind of winks at Frodo and the other hobbits. And then he puts it on his finger, and he doesn't disappear. And then he flips it in the air and makes it disappear. And then he hands it back to Frodo and laughs. And Frodo is so put out by all of this sort of trivialization of something that's so important. He puts the ring on his finger and tries to sneak away from the table. And Bombadil says, he just watches him. He says, "Where are you going, Frodo? Come back here and sit down." He's not even affected in that way. He can see Frodo when he's got the ring on. So what's going on with Bombadil? Well, there are a lot of things that we see in Bombadil that I think are intended to serve as a kind of foil to the underlying kind of, I guess, drama of the Lord of the Rings. And that drama is the temptation that raw power is to any one of us, and how it obviously corrupts us, but also why it's really not as valuable as we might assume it is, or I think I seem to believe it is. But Bombadil may be more powerful than Sauron, and he doesn't feel the need to impress anybody or control anything, and that's why he's a foil. He is the most powerful creature in Middle Earth, and he could care less.
Yeah. Talk about mastery in that context.
That's right.
Yeah, talking about pursuit of power too ties in really well.
Right, content. Bombadil is content.
Yeah. So, Richard in the chat, I just thought I'd say this while I have it. He said, "I love Wiley's book, Household and War for the Cosmos. Was such a refreshing drink of water. Thank you."
Well, you're welcome. I enjoyed writing it.
So, Joey, have you ever read Lord of the Rings yet?
No.
What?
Maybe that's what I do when I'm up at night holding baby.
There you go.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes, that's true. So Chris, can you please make the pitch for Joey as to why he should take the time to read those great works?
Well, I've watched some of the films, and they pale in comparison to the riches that you can enjoy if you actually read the books. So I'm glad
I've not watched the films either, so there's that.
Connor
can attest.
The main rendition that Joey has watched that all of us are very familiar with and is definitely one of the best cinematic portrayals of Tolkien is the 1977. Is it 77?
I think it's 77 or 78.
Ralph
1977
Bakshi?
Hobbit. Yeah.
Okay. Rankin and Bass. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Rankin and Bass. That's what
Yeah,
it is.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
That'd
Well,
be
that
sick.
wasn't too bad in certain ways. It's certainly better than Bakshi's and better than Peter Jackson.
Well, definitely Peter
We
Jackson's
can agree
hot,
on
that's for sure.
Right.
So, but what's interesting is to kind of loop this back into our larger conversation. There's an interesting ability for stories to kind of pierce a person's soul in a way that facts and logic does not have the capability of doing. Um, Rod Dreher wrote a book, "Live Not by Lies," and he tells a story of many individuals that have been underneath totalitarian regimes. And one of the stories that he told was of a family, and they said that their parents read them The Lord of the Rings growing up, and they were able to recognize that they were in a totalitarian regime, even though they knew nothing different, because they understood that there are places like Mordor in the world. So what is it about stories that are able to do that are able to capture individuals and help them to maybe take the blinders off for a moment for something that maybe ideology might be blinding them to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it a lot. I don't want to dominate the conversation though, but the things that come to mind immediately for me are stories engage us at every level. So, abstract thought is not something that everybody finds congenial, let alone accessible. And often philosophy or theology in its most sort of high-flown expressions is very difficult for people to engage in or sort of relate to or benefit from. Stories, on the other hand, are, marvelous in the sense that they draw everybody in, no matter what level of sort of education they possess or age that they are at. And then they allude to the full range of the senses. Well-told stories bring to mind sights and smells and sounds, and so they fully sort of draw us in to this sort of imaginary that they present to us. Every story has that kind of imaginary that we enter into. When we think about fantasies like Tolkien's, but even when we think about something as maybe as realistic or as presented as realistic as possible, like say maybe something by a contemporary author who's just trying to describe the daily life of a person in New York City. And then we're fully brought into this sort of world of the senses, and we can dip into it as deeply as we want. People read The Lord of the Rings and just enjoy a great adventure story. Other people read The Lord of the Rings and it changes their entire worldview.
Yeah, I know it did for me. But now what's interesting is I know that you're not a fan of the movies, but my introduction to Lord of the Rings was the movies, and part of that just being my age. Around the time they came out was around the time that I was pretty much beginning to watch movies. And but what's interesting to me is that allowed me to eventually desire to read the books. And now that I've read the books, I'm very much of the same mindset as you, as the books are so much richer than the movies. But for me, I enjoyed the movies still. I think that there's still definitely a place for those. But I'm curious what it was about the movies that turned you off.
Well, I think have you read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories?
I have read parts of it, yes.
Well, one of the things he has to say is that literature and film are just different media,
Mm-hmm.
and they're each is good at something out different, and there's something that just doesn't translate. when you take a story that's literary in character and try to translate it into something that's visual in character. I think films are fine. They're good for certain things, but they're not good for everything. And sort of the inner meaning of things is something that films don't have an ability to convey unless they, in a heavy-handed way through narration, try to get you into the mind of the protagonist. But literature does that. Literature is sort of the inner life of characters. So you can see them interacting with their settings by following their thinking, not just their behaviors. So I think that's something that Tolkien brings out on fairy stories. He talks about that. In terms of do I wish that the films had never been made? No, I think I'm glad that people like yourself, Connor, have started with the films and then decided I want to actually read the books, and I think that happened for a lot of people.
Yeah, it definitely introduced them to a broader audience. That's for sure. So when it comes to culture building, then that's something that we've talked about quite a bit on this show as well. Do you think that culture building through storytelling is a crucial tool for us to be utilizing as believers to sort of start to turn the culture in a positive direction?
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think you have culture without stories. At the heart of every culture is a set of stories. So what are our stories? I think what we see with wokeism is a rejection of the formative stories of the United States. And we could evaluate the critiques of those stories that they've made. I think they have some merit, but I also think that they don't present us with anything, I think, compelling or universal enough to replace them. So I don't think that the woke are going to succeed. I think they will help destroy, but I don't think that they're going to replace anything. They're not capable of it.
Evil cannot create; it can only corrupt.
What are some stories that have influenced American culture that you would like to see retained and promoted?
Well, I do think that the American story places a great stress on the individual and his or her moral character. Now, the criticisms of our stories have to do with the fact that we haven't lived up to our stories. That's always the case. I mean, what's new? The Jews didn't live up to their stories. The Romans didn't live up to their stories. I mean, there's nothing new in that. What stories do you have to present to replace them? I don't think that basically the stories that they present are stories of people who are marginal, who are to be pitied, and triumph over the evils of white men, and that's about it. But if you were to eliminate the four of us from existence and all of the people who resemble us, they wouldn't have anything to say. You see what I'm getting at? They're not actually getting at the core issues. We serve the role of the devil for them. And remove us from the scene and they don't have anything to say. Well, what they would probably say is they just adopt their stories and put blackface on George Washington or something.
Yeah. So when it comes to storytelling, then one of the things that I find really interesting is when it comes to evangelizing and winning souls for the Lord. One of the big things that we are called to do is to give our testimony. So what's interesting is, Michael, you've mentioned you've been observing the Asbury revival, and there are so many speculations as to what exactly is going on there. But one of the things that you mentioned to me previously is that there are a lot of individuals that were getting up and giving their testimony. So were you noticing a shift in the room when individuals got up and shared their testimony?
I wouldn't call it a shift in the room. There was a normalcy about confession and what has been taking place. I mean, if you don't know, Asbury University had a chapel service on February 8th that is continued until this afternoon. And it's, in fact, they're working on moving it to a separate site now, is kind of the latest, because it has grown to be upwards of 15,000 people in a small town, just overwhelming everyone. But in the early days of what was happening, it started with students simply getting up and confessing their sins, expressing a desire for repentance, and then asking for prayer and deliverance from the community of believers as well as from God. So I wouldn't say that it's a change in anything except that there was time allocated for praise and worship. There was time allocated for testimonies. There was time allocated for exhortation and teaching in that space. And it has been fairly cyclical in that pattern for the past 2 weeks now. So the sharing of stories, though, is a very important part of our Christian tradition and of our call as believers, I think. Makes me think of Revelation, is it chapter 9, when the dragon is cast down and overcome by the blood of the Lamb, which is the sacrifice of Christ, and the word of our testimony, the word of the testimony. And we are participators in that victory insofar as we can testify to Christ's victory in our own lives.
Yeah. It's interesting the amount of third hand information that is going around about Asbury. Chris, I mean, you're on the total opposite side of the map of the country. Have you heard a lot about the revival in your neck of the woods?
Not word of mouth in this area, just stuff on social media.
What kind of tends to be the trend? Yeah, go ahead. Same question.
Well, I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Go ahead, Michael.
I was asking, what is your take then from the lens that you've heard these things about?
Oh, well, I've got mixed thoughts. On the one hand, what you just said, Michael, about stories, I agree with completely. On the other hand, when we think about testimony and we think about what that meant in the New Testament, I wonder if people have a disconnect. So I'm actually working on a commentary in the book of Acts. And when we see, what we see in the book of Acts is a series of courtroom dramas. And what I mean by that is testimony literally meant kind of what is implied in a courtroom setting. Eyewitness testimony of a physical event or an event that was seen. So it's the resurrection. The resurrection is the thing that the apostles are witnessing to, wherever they can give the testimony. They saw the risen Lord. And it wasn't their personal experience that they were testifying to. I challenge anybody to go and look at the book of Acts and say, this is the Apostle Paul telling just his story. Now, what is his story? He's talking about his encounter with the risen Lord, an actual encounter with the risen Lord, not his emotional state, not his struggle with whatever. So the emotivism of this sort of thing is the thing that I find least appealing. And I think the emotivism plays into kind of the modern sort of sensibility that we are at our most authentic, just emotive selves. I don't think that's the actual case. I think that the truest self, our true selves, are our moral and judging sort of selves. So the moral self is the true self, not the emotive self. The emotive self was always considered in antiquity the part of yourself that needed to be regulated, controlled, directed. that was where the danger lied. And this is one of the reasons why it wasn't, if we were to do, this would be an interesting study. Sexual deviancy and sexual kind of gratification and its relationship to revivalist movements. When I was, a youth counselor at Christian camps, you had to keep your eye out for kids going off into the woods right after altar call. Anyway, that maybe says too much.
That's interesting to hear, because even in my own experience with what's been going on here, the most profound experience of repentance that I have witnessed so far, and I haven't been there for every single confession or repentance, whatever, but early on, I think it was Thursday after it had started on a Wednesday, there were students that were confessing having had an addiction to pornography and were finding freedom from that and asking for prayer and deliverance and expressing their faith in Christ to do those things. So while there are certainly those who would go get up from the altar and go and participate in sexual deviance, there's also those that are repenting of their sexual deviations as well and attempting to find a new way beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I don't deny that can happen.
Yeah.
So, and maybe I misunderstood your line of thinking, Chris, but were you kind of the mindset of that emotionalism is leading to sort of romantic interest kind of developing just as a result of emotions being high and sort of that co-opting the actual purpose of the revival?
Yeah, I think emotivism is something so our emotional selves are great. I mean, we are emotional creatures. That's a dimension of our lives, what it means to be a human being. But it's not the highest, it's not the place. So let me put it this way. C.S. Lewis talks about, and he's expressing the ancient view, the head, the chest, and the belly. There's a hierarchy within each one of us. The moral judgment governs both our appetites and our passions. The passion itself is the emotive self. It must be governed just like the appetites. Now, it's the place where we bring, it's the means by which we often can control our appetites, but it can also overcome us. So we live in an age of emotivism. So this phenomenon is not challenging at all is the emotivism of our time.
I would push back just a hair, if I may, to say that there's a few different things that I want to address in what you're saying as far as a representation of what's happened here in Wilmore, Kentucky, specifically, since that's the context of what we're talking about. For one, I think there are many even who are here who are weary to call it a revival, because certainly a revival is marked by the fruit that it produces, not by the experience itself. So I think we are yet to determine whether or not it is in fact a successful revival and not just an experiential, emotive circumstance. And part of what I'd like to push back on you, Chris, is that it sounds like you're representing what's taking place in this revival setting as being emotive at the heart of it. And I would argue to say that that's a fairly reductive perspective on what's taking place, and that there are, especially in this context, having been an academic institution, there's a lot of intellectual stimulation that goes into the confessions, that also goes into the testimonies, and goes into the deliverances from sin, from physical and spiritual affirmity as well. There's a lot that's been taking place here. To be clear, there are some who have come simply to get the emotional high and feel good and feel affirmed in their practice of worship, whether those be Pentecostals shouting in tongues or thrashing around on the floor. I'm not going to say that that's not happening as well. However, there's a lot, I think, to be said for the individuals that are coming into the space, meditating on the Word of God, and finding conviction through the Word of God so that they can reference those texts and passages and the exhortation of the individual preachers so that they are coming to repentance by those intellectual means, and in so doing, allowing their moral mind to govern their passions.
Well, I hope you're right.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think ultimately, kind of what you said, Michael, is we won't know if this was legitimate until we might not even be alive. The fruit that can be sown, or the seeds that can be sown in 2023 might not take root and bear fruit until 30 years from now, for all we know. And I don't know, because it's planting seeds. I think I am skeptical, but I'm going to try to remain optimistic about what's happening in Wilmore and beyond, while also noting that at bare minimum, if the worship is genuine, whether this becomes a revival or this just ended up being a outpouring of worship 4 days and days on end in Kentucky, ultimately, I think it's still a net positive. The only thing that would make me think it's a negative if there if there has only been individuals coming just for an experience and nothing beyond that, nothing that removes the individuals in attendance from viewing themselves to, keeping their focus on Christ and his holiness. So that's the only thing that would spoil it for me, is if it is all a show and there's no fruit, whether that be worship or a true revival.
Well, it's certainly a mixed batch, no matter how you look at it, because there's no way that everyone comes with the same intentions or that those intentions are valid or pure. So with the quantity of people that have come into this tiny town, like I said, in excess of 15,000, such that the police had to actually go to the roads and stop people from coming into the town because the infrastructure couldn't handle it anymore. That's where we've been the past few days. And there's a lot of skepticism. There was skepticism at the very beginning when it was just a local event. And now that it's become this weird, nationally recognized event, I don't know how to characterize it at this time, but there's even greater skepticism that comes from that. And even if those individuals that are coming for the wrong reasons leave and show no fruit of it, there are certainly those that have come and sought out the Spirit of God and found what they were looking for. And I think the big argument around that is, why didn't you just find the Spirit of God where you were to begin with? That's the question that has been on many of our minds. And I've heard numerous stories from individuals who have said, in my hometown, at my home church, there's complacency. I came here to see what it could be like. And then they take that back with them in hopes that they could invigorate their congregations or their communities with a desire to worship and a desire to act in repentance and to have community with one another. And that's, I think, a very positive outcome of this, if nothing else.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to just remain prayerful and hope that whatever's going down, that if the Spirit's moving, if Aslan's truly on the move, let's hope that we see some winter start to thaw.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we'll go ahead and end on that note, but Chris, where can people find you and keep up with everything you're doing?
Well, I do have a website, crwiley.com, but I don't update it very often. It's just basically a landing page where people can see what I've written and maybe see a few interviews that I've been given or I've subjected myself to. But, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and places like that. And I don't use those things very well. I just kind of like vent every once in a while, like most people.
Yeah. Awesome. And remind me, is your Tom Bombadil book out currently, or is it about to be released?
Oh, it's been out. Yeah, it's
Okay.
received a lot of great press, and you can find it on the different places people buy books.
Awesome. We'll have to throw it up on the shelf.
Great.
Awesome. Well, Joey, where can people keep up with you?
You can keep up with me here on the podcast when I'm on.
Awesome. Michael?
I'll be studying the middle passive participle in Greek. A thrilling time, truly.
Excellent. And you can find Forge and Anvil officially now on Twitter. I finally decided to jump into the cesspool that is Twitter. So our handle is Forge and A. So feel free to follow us there. I'd appreciate it. I'm going to try to retweet some CR Wiley here and there and have my own rants and ravings and various tantrums, I have no doubt. So feel free to follow us there. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. We hope you have a fantastic